Hello, and thank you so much for continuing to be with us at the Vendors Hall. We are very excited for this panel. We have had such a great time with all of the vendors. We want to remind you to go check out what they've got going on in the vendors room, vendorshall.com. Hall is H-A-U-L. And we are just thrilled for this conversation. I have wanted to have these questions about Tribbles answered since I was probably not 6 years old, because I'm not sure my grasp on science was good enough at that point, but for a really long time. So this is so exciting. I should tell you who I am. I'm Kayleigha. I'm from Science Division. We are putting on this Vendors Hall convention.
I'm Jay. I'm the other side of the Vendors Hall, or well,
Science
Division, and we're the maker of the app-enabled Tribbles.
And that is why we are here talking with Dr. Mohamed Noor, who knows probably more about Tribbles than anybody, because he can tell us how they work. So thank you for being here with us.
It's convenient they're fictional, because I can just make up stuff and that could be right.
Well, that's the easy answer, I guess.
Yeah, right. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for being here for Vendors Hall. I know it's a distracting day, but thanks for everybody who's watching.
Yeah, so we have this question to start off with, and that is, what is the taxonomy of a tribble? Like, how do we even define what they are?
That is a phenomenal question. So let me just frame it a little bit in the sense. So when you think of most animals, you think of the standard Linnaean taxonomy. So this goes back to 1735, Carlos Linnaeus. You think of, for example, if you're thinking about a dog, it's an animal, it's a vertebrate, it has a backbone, it's a mammal, it's hairy and gives milk to its young, and it's canine just based on its appearance. And what's interesting about those taxonomy things is those reflect evolutionary history, right? And that wasn't known at the time, 1730s. But like, you know, if you see like a dog and a fox, they share a lot of the same attributes. A dog and a cat share fewer, a dog and a seagull share fewer, et cetera, et cetera. Tribble is tough because like when you're looking at something that is like fully alien, those things don't work anymore. Like you can say, oh, it's hairy, so it's a mammal. Like, yeah, but it's not like it's closely related to mammals on Earth. It might not have a backbone. I mean, what was the guy's name? Edward. Yeah, exactly. He commented that they're kind of like a scallop inside. Right? So it's really hard to say. I mean, I think in some sense, you would have to think of them, if they're truly alien, if they're not related to life on Earth, they'd be like in their own kingdom. Like they're not even what we would define as animals. Like they just be this completely other thing. And that's interesting. And that's really important in the sense of framing. I'm sure the other questions we're going to be asking, in that the things we assume about animals may not apply when you're talking about Tribble, because it's not an animal. It's not from Earth. So anything, even though it looks vaguely like, you know, a mouse kind of without a tail and without a head, right. I guess, without legs, none of those things would necessarily apply. So that's a great starting question.
Some of the words that we use may not be possible to really discuss because they are inherently a human-centric and a Earth-centric kind of frame, yeah. Right? So some of the things that we immediately would imply with when you hear the word mammal may not apply to a species on another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about something that's truly alien. Like nothing else necessarily applies. Like any sort of taxonomy is no longer valid there. It's its own lineage. So you have to just make up its own kingdom, phylum, blah, 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 all those steps down to the species.
Right.
Well, we aren't going to ask you to do that, but
no, thank you.
I am curious about this idea of being born pregnant. And is that something, I mean, we've just discussed, like, it's not an Earth-based life form or whatever, but like, how does that work? Does it work?
That's a great question. So, I mean, things can be born pregnant. I mean, especially if we assume tribbles are asexual, which actually they're not, and I'll come back to that in a minute. If we assume tribbles are asexual, then to some extent, almost every asexual, I mean, think about it, there's a lot of species that actually reproduce through budding, like we're like, you know, like Hydra. It literally just grows a little baby Hydra off its side. So those cells that eventually grew into that other Hydra, some of them may have been there when it was, I mean, whatever it was, this stage. I mean, I guess you don't have Hydra pregnancies per se, but whatever it was in that previous stage, they were already there. So if you're thinking about something asexual, I mean, they could always be born pregnant. Now, Tribbles are not asexual. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But I think they're referred to by McCoy as bisexual, meaning that they actually they essentially like have both male and female genders, assuming that again in this alien world they have those same two genders.
Right. I think we need to assume that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Well, assume some of those things, otherwise it just gets crazy. But in that sense, I mean, if you think about it, if you're what does born mean? Born, you say born is coming out of the female's womb or something like that. Tribbles they're probably produced in litters. If there's multiple tribbles and they're inside there, maybe they're doing the deed inside the mother's womb. I mean, there's nothing to say that can't be happening. Alternatively, they could be self-fertilizing. Maybe they're bisexual, but they actually reproduce with themselves. So one of the worms that's most often used in developmental research is called C. elegans. It's a very commonly used model organism, but it can actually just self-fertilize itself. So could something self-fertilize itself in the womb? Sure. I mean, there's no barrier to that. I mean, all the parts are there. The opportunity is present.
So I'm a little curious then. So if a species, and maybe it's not just tribbles, but we can go into what we know a little bit more. But
sure,
you know, when you have a creature that can procreate by itself, right? What does that do to the gene pool? I would think that the way that we often will think about it with two parents, their genes come together and then form a new being, right? And so then there's some cross between and sharing of genes to create an offspring.
Yep.
When there's only one, how does that work? And does
it's a great question.
evolve quicker, or because you're not bringing more genes back into it and it's just constantly like how does that work in our real life?
That's a wonderful question. So it depends is the short answer. So if a species is truly asexual, then basically it's just making clones of itself, right? So, in that sense, it's just, not to use the Star Wars kind of clones, but basically genetically nearly identical copies of itself. So, I mean, the only difference between, say, a clone and the original will be any mutations that happen to crop up in that line. So, and that's actually somewhat problematic to have things that are truly asexual because over time, it's like, think of like taking a copy, like a Xerox copy of a copy. I mean, eventually like that, it gets really faded and there's no way to fix it because you're never mixing things up. Now, if something truly self-fertilizes, now in this sense, now it's not asexual, but it's actually bisexual, but it's self-fertilizing. Then you are actually potentially making new combinations, but you have a very, very limited pool. Like basically, like if we assume that like humans, they have 2 copies of every gene, right? Then the number of possible combinations is much more limited than if it was like something that could breed outside, right? Essentially, imagine, if you imagine the old Punnett squares from like high school biology, like imagine a tribble is big A, little a. If it's breeding with itself, it can make big A offspring, or it can make little a offspring, or it can make big A, little a offspring. It can, in theory, make any of those things, but it can't make A prime because it didn't have that.
Right.
So there's some opportunities, but it's much more limited. And that's actually one of the potential advantages, the fact that it can actually like mix up things a little bit. It can potentially get rid of bad mutations if some of them do crop up. And that coupled with the fact that they have such large numbers of offspring, then there's more opportunity that like, okay, I'm going to keep the very best ones. I mean, it's not an intentional process, it's just what nature does. The healthiest ones will be the ones that produce the most. The least healthy will be the ones that produce the least. And you essentially can keep it going for a fair amount of time. So that worm I mentioned, C. elegans, it is mostly bisexual. 99% of the time it's bisexual, but 1% of the time it actually will make these little males. So normally it's bisexual, but sometimes it'll just make a male. And the male will then sometimes go through and fertilize some of the bisexual others. But 99% of the time it's fine.
That's fascinating.
So how do we get from the brown tribbles and the more neutral colored tribbles that we have on Trouble with Tribbles to the pink animated tribbles, other than the fact that we know that there was somebody that was colorblind involved in the process?
That's a great answer.
If we throw the actual production history out, how would science get us to pink tribbles?
That's a great answer. So some of it will be just that sort of that big A, little a kind of thing, like I was saying, in the sense that, that most of what's happening, assuming they're bisexual, assuming they're born pregnant, in the sense that they're self-fertilizing, you can have a little bit of mixing of things. And, again, it's not one gene, but there's probably a whole bunch of genes that contribute to color, I'm assuming, with these tribbles. My guess is that they're going to be a little bit more like that C. elegans worm, where they're mostly that way, but every now and then we have like 2 little tribbles. come together, and that will then introduce like a ton more variation. And that's usually true, that most of the species that are self-fertilizing are often not exclusively so, but they'll just have this very low level of sexual reproduction that they'll do every now and then. And that may happen, maybe, especially if you're in a big grain storage bin. There's plenty of opportunity there.
Is that something that kind of becomes a thing with like environmental things? Like, is it if they couldn't find a mate, then they would try to self-replicate?
Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's conditions of stress. Like that's definitely one of the things that does stimulate that to happen. It depends on the species, of course, but yeah, that's definitely one of the things that does stimulate that to happen. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that.
Sorry, I'm taking it away from actual Tribbles. Do you have a whole list?
But that may be true for Tribbles too. Maybe they. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say we're hitting on a lot of this stuff on the list, so you're good.
Yeah. That may be what happens with Tribbles. Maybe when they're starving, that tends to be the time when they're more likely to say, like, "Well, you know what? Times are tough. I'm gonna find my partner Tribble and do the thing."
I mean, poison grain, poisonous food, that would stress me out. So.
Yeah.
But so then the next question I have is Tribble. We're not just talking about biology because there's so much genetic manipulation discussed and implied and all of this stuff with Tribbles. And if you go back, to the short trek, we have Edward who says, well, it sucks because they actually multiply really, really slowly. And then supposedly he splices human DNA in, and that's what makes them replicate quickly. So like, can you take an element, can you take something like, humans reproduce, plug it into another species, and now all of a sudden they reproduce like crazy?
I mean, it's oversimplified, but potentially yes. Potentially yes. I mean, we have genes that we actually introduce, for example, into fruit flies. So I work with fruit flies primarily rather than Tribbles, but we have genes that we introduce into fruit flies that like can make their eyes fluorescent, for example. That that are obtained from very, very distantly related species. So yeah, I mean, introducing the genes is not a problem. In terms of the speed of reproduction, there are known clock genes and things like that. So, I mean, those kinds of things potentially could influence how fast it's reproducing. So that part in and of itself is okay. Now, specifically saying I picked human, maybe, but again, like it's not like these guys are closely related to us. So who knows if that would actually work in that context? But I'm sure something could do that. Some sort of genetic manipulation could do that. Maybe the human version could. I mean, to some extent, we don't even know that Tribbles have DNA, right?
Right.
Well, and I just thought it was kind of strange. Like, I maybe a plot point or point of convenience that it was a human DNA addition that made them breed quickly because there are so many species, known
to
breed
way faster than humans.
Faster?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not bunny?
Right. I mean, I think it was done for humor in the episode.
I think so, especially given it was himself too. There was that long discussion about that.
Yeah, it was for the setup, but it is interesting that that's part of canon now.
Yep. Edward's DNA is inside.
But there's also this element of feeding them and how that works into reproduction. And if you feed it, it produces faster. And then there's kind of a question, if you don't feed it, it doesn't reproduce, but then does it die or does it just not need food and food makes it make babies?
That's a great question. So in terms of if you the don't feed it part is easier than the do feed it part. So if you don't feed it, there's plenty of animals that will go into like a torpor if they don't. So it's kind of like hibernating, where if they're not fed, they just kind of their activity level goes really down. And maybe even though these look like mammals, maybe they're actually cold blooded. So maybe like we have some my family and I have some bearded dragons downstairs. Every like winter from August to January, they just climb into the cave and just go to sleep, and like we don't feed them for 6 months or something. They're fine. They're okay with this. It's often in their case, it's actually environmental signals in the sense of like shortening daytime. That's what signals them to say like, oh, time for me to go to sleep. But for some species, it easily could be just amount of food. Now, the tricky thing is the reproductive capacity. And I think you were getting at this a little bit in terms of these Tribbles. That Tribbles, they make a lot of other Tribbles, even seemingly in the absence of a whole lot of grain. This is tough, right? Because there's this whole thing of like conservation of mass, right? There's like, they're made up for sure. It doesn't matter what their taxonomy is. They're surely made up of atoms.
Right.
What are the atoms that become Tribble? Like, where do they come from? It's tough because, I mean, if you think about like, so what are we made up of? We have like carbohydrates, fats, proteins. So mostly in terms of elements, we're talking about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and some phosphorus, right? I mean, some of that you can get from the air. You can get a little bit of the oxygen out, maybe a tiny bit of carbon from the CO2, but the volume that would be needed to make like the rolling thing of Tribbles in Trouble with Tribble, or the giant Tribble in the animated series thing, like that would be a ton.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think someone in the chat was saying every time I brush my bunny, I get a Tribble. But
Yeah, right.
I don't know if you can take the pile of fur and turn it into a living. I guess we don't know that they breathe.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. They may not. Well, I guess they make sound. Well, they're at least vibrating sound because they're making the sound. So at least vibrating
Right.
sound. But it's unclear if it's actually like using it to get oxygen. That's true. It's a good point.
So then I guess the question is then Cyrano Jones also supposedly genetically altered Tribbles to
Yeah.
then get them to take grain and cease turning it into more Tribbles and instead make them get fat.
Yes.
Like, is that something? Can you change what they're doing with the matter?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You could definitely do it. So, I mean, being engineered to be sterile may well make them fat, right? And you know, we have limited resources in our body. Every living thing has limited resource, and there's often trade-offs. So when resources are not going to reproduction or early reproduction, they may be more likely to go to growth or metabolism. And to some extent, we honestly see this sometimes, like with like our pets, that when you neuter your dog, sometimes they get fat, or their cat, they sometimes get fat. So some of that, like, we even see too. There's a lot of studies, by the way, that show that this trade-off between, say, longevity or something in terms. So I'm equating growth with longevity, but I know that's a little problem. With longevity, I'm talking about like how long something lives.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of studies that show trade-offs between offspring numbers and longevity. That if you have fewer offspring, you live longer and things like that. It's not a stretch to assume longevity can be replaced with size in the context of resource use. But again, you know, the studies have looked at this have looked in the context of early reproduction specifically, not just overall lifetime reproduction. But maybe that's what's happening. Maybe the Tribbles live really long and they still reproduce just as much, but they do it over like 20 years instead of 20 minutes.
Well, we were watching the episode last night, and I think the explanation that McCoy gave that is a Tribble, they're actually colonies. So the fat Tribbles were actually colonies of Tribbles, and then you get to this point where if you shoot it with a phaser, it erupts into a billion.
Yeah, that was bizarre. I just watched that too. That was bizarre.
In science that can help that make sense, or is it just a Saturday morning cartoon and we need to not think about it?
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, it sort of reminded me like of a spider egg sac or something like that, I guess. Yeah, you've seen the sort of spider egg sac with like tons of baby spiders come out.
Right.
Yes.
So in that case, it's not that it's just getting fat; it's that it is reproducing. It's just containing all of it.
I guess. Yeah. I mean, I think it's easier with the getting fat, but yeah, it's true. You're right. In that episode, they did imply that they're actually, or they did show that they're actually just keeping the Tribbles inside.
It's something more that could be like a coral reef, right? It's of lots of little organisms that grow into something bigger.
Yeah, but all in one big shell.
Yeah.
Gotta feel bad for the mom there. Oof.
Well, then the next question that, again, has to come out of the animated series is then if you have altered this Tribble to make it get fat instead of reproduce, can you just give it a shot of some kind of serum and just solve because that's what McCoy does. He goes, I give it a shot, now it's not going to get fat and it's not pregnant.
So I mentioned that trade-off between reproduction and longevity. There are foods or there are chemicals which will act as what we call a dietary switch. That it's like, okay, I was investing in this, and I'm going to switch over to that. So one of them's what's it called? Resveratrol. I think it comes from grapes or something like that. But that's one of the ones that acts as a dietary switch. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. And in flies, resveratrol is known to extend lifespan, but to reduce at least early fertility.
Huh.
So you could have a Tribble that would be, in fact, the perfect Tribble that would live forever or for a long time and not reproduce. And you should go to sciencediff.com and check.
Are you guys going to sell the giant ones that you can like explode into little Tribbles?
Last night I looked at Jay. We were totally kidding, but I was like, all right, so our next project.
That would be hilarious.
So I guess we've talked about all these different places that Tribbles have appeared. And the question that I have is there a way that we can reconcile Tribble canon? because Tribbles also appear in Enterprise, and Phlox has one, and he is feeding it to things and saying, like, they recreate like crazy. But then we have Edward saying, oh, too bad they recreate so slowly. And then, you know, there's just all of these versions, and are they even all the same Tribble?
That's a great question. So, well, the same Tribble, probably not. That would be interesting. But I think it comes back to variation. Like, there's a lot of variation within a lot of species, right? So it's possible that there are multiple different versions of Tribbles. You could go extreme and call them subspecies or races, but it may just be just variation. Like, if you look at, you know, people on Earth, we don't all look the same. We don't all behave the same. We don't all have the same metabolism. Maybe that's true among Tribbles. And heck, maybe Tribbles even exist on multiple planets.
They're warp capable, you know?
Warp capable Tribbles.
Yeah, warp capable Tribbles. Imagine the Klingon cruiser that comes across that.
Gotta make that canon possible, right?
Yeah, you're flying around, you look out the window, and there's a Tribble.
Yeah.
I see somebody in the comments says that Edwards just considers the normal reproduction rate slow in that person's opinion.
That can make sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely, he made them fast. That's for sure. Like that avalanche of Tribble thing was pretty extreme.
Yes, and they weren't eaten. So this kind of goes back to our what is now making them.
Exactly. Like, again, this conservation of mass. I mean, it's not a biology thing. It's like a physics thing. But I mean, they need something. Some atoms need to be becoming Tribble. It's not really clear what they are. I mean, unless they're made of nitrogen or something like that. I don't know.
There's something really problematic with Edward's genes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you do think about it, I mean, trees are mostly made up of air, right? Are chemicals that gotten from the air.
But they're getting a lot of nutrients from the soil too. They're getting a lot of water and things like that as well.
There's a lot of air that goes into it. You know, like I think there's more air than I think most people generally realize.
Yeah, exactly. When you're on a planet, it's very different when you're on a space station, because on the planet, obviously, like, you know, the air is just so abundant.
Right. But
it's a fair point. It's a fair point.
I think there's a lot more matter floating around us than we generally think about.
Exactly. No, 100% agree with that.
So we've kind of talked about genetic manipulation and all of this, but the Klingons in the TAS, and I'm going to keep going back to this because I think there's so much problematic or so much to unpack in this particular episode. And one of those things is the Glommer, and that is this predator that has been specifically engineered just to eat Tribbles. That they don't talk about it having come from anything. They have just created it.
That's a great question.
Can you go, I have this problem. I don't think we should, because obviously there's trouble in science with messing with the way that
That's a great question. So thinking about that, the short answer is like maybe, but let me elaborate a little bit. The way I would do that, if I want to do that, is I'm imagining the Glommer. I mean, a lot of predators use olfactory cues, right? They're looking for something by smell. What you could do is you could basically make it so a particular species, and this actually is not, well, it depends on the species, but it potentially is not impossibly hard. You can make it so they're hypersensitized to particular smells and completely desensitized to others. I mean, there's a lot of work on fruit flies. Against I work on fruit flies. Sorry, I keep coming back to them. Though fruit flies have much simpler olfactory systems than, like, say, mammals and others do. But let's say that this Glommer maybe has a fairly simple one with not that many neurons. You can make it so basically it doesn't smell other foods besides the Tribble, but it does smell Tribbles, and especially if Tribbles have something that, like, they can home in on. At that point, maybe you would ignore everything else. Like, I don't know what that is. Oh, that's food. Oh.
I mean, we are talking about the Klingons, in theory, made this. You know, like at that time, you know, they had warp-capable ships. Like, it's not like a small civilization. They have a fair amount of technology.
Totally. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that you can make it, if not specific, at least like very strongly prefer it, where they're like hypersensitized to Tribbles. Maybe they're willing to eat other things, but they're hypersensitive to that. Like, whoa.
And they did say it was hard to do, and that's why they had the one. And then
no, totally fair.
Kind of makes sense there.
But I guess I'm kind of blown away by how quickly this supposedly happened, right? Because the timeline is Cyrano Jones sells Tribbles to this one Klingon planet, and all of a sudden they're like, we have built this thing and it's going to take them out. Especially if you're starting from scratch, the way they say that. I'm assuming there's some time and trial and error involved.
Or they may be leveraging other things. Maybe they had some other they may have had some other pest on their homeworld that wasn't Tribbles, and they were already figuring out the techniques. So they literally just had to say, "Oh, okay, well let's just do the same thing here using CRISPR or whatever genetic manipulation technique and target this particular thing." Maybe it's possible. And I have no idea how long. I mean, we saw those glomeras in the TAS episode. I don't know what their lifespan is like. If let's say they're fairly short-lived, I mean, it's possible. Again, possible. I'm giving a lot of credit, of course, to the writers.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking they would have to also reproduce like crazy, right? Because I guess this is kind of a timeline question, right? Because if you have a good Tribble to glomer ratio, then Tribbles aren't reproducing crazy quickly because they're being kept. But so then how do you balance that? Like to get to a point where it's a balanced ecosystem, or are we just assuming that Klingons don't care?
I think they don't care. Well, I think didn't they only have the one glomer? Isn't that why they were chasing Cyrano Jones?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think they were happy just to eradicate the planet eradicate the planet of Tribbles, and they don't care if the glomers die in the process. I don't think they care. I think they were just happy to eliminate the problem and then be done. It's funny because biological controls often fail. They often are bad. So the classic example people always bring up is in Hawaii in the 1930s, they introduced cane toads to get rid of the cane grubs there. And cane toads largely ignored the cane grubs, but then they reproduced like crazy and ate like everything else. So this may be what the Klingon homeworld will be facing with these glomers. Except we do know the glomer actually does eat the Tribbles. We did see that happen. So,
well, I guess that would be obviously one would think that there would be testing that went, that what you would do, like, does it eat them? You have no way to know once you release it out into the actual food chain, like how that is going to go.
That's absolutely right. And the Klingons tend to be fast and loose with rules. So,
Although one thing we did notice was in that particular episode, the TIS episode that we keep going back to, they seem to be like the most reasonable Klingons that you've ever seen. Because they're like, oh, well, we're not going to destroy your grain ship. We'll just disable it. But they also start the episode out shooting like stormtroopers, right? They're like, the ship, and every single shot is missing the ship.
It was interesting that this grain ship could crash into the Klingon ship, and that was they couldn't just shoot the engines and knock it out pretty easy. I would think that would be pretty easy, but apparently not.
I think what we're coming to is there are some plot holes in the TO.
Yeah, it's okay.
So then what we see apparently, in the Deep Space Nine episode, they travel back, and those Tribbles look a little different, but we're going to just say that's because they remanufactured them because they had to. But these Tribbles that have been supposedly wiped out, this entire species has been wiped out by the great Klingon Tribble hunt.
Yep.
But then all of these Tribbles come back to Quark's bar.
Yep. Hopefully they didn't get beamed into space like they thought was happening in the original episode. That would be really awful. Tribbles frozen in space. Oh.
What do you do with a space? Because then they just disappear.
Yeah. Well, so that's a good question. So my guess, I'm speculating here. Didn't Spock in the original Tribbles make some comment about that there being predators on their homeworld? I think he made some kind of saying by removing them from their predatory filled homeworld, something like that. I can't remember the exact verbiage. Maybe they just took it back there, and just said we're going to dump them there. Predators score. We haven't seen these in forever. I'm assuming those predators still exist, but if those predators still exist, presumably they eat other things too. Because if they only ate Tribbles and Tribbles were gone, then that doesn't work. But if maybe those were generalist predators and you can plop them down there, they might be like, oh, score, Thanksgiving.
Because otherwise you get to this other place where those predators don't exist anymore because the Klingons wiped out all the Tribbles.
That's right.
Now you have all the Tribbles again. And so now we're into this. Well, now we have to try to genetic. So basically, no matter what, are just always trouble.
Yep, they're always trouble. No, the other option, I guess, is there's a Klingon chef, I believe, on Deep Space Nine too. So maybe he has Scallop Night.
Well, I guess this goes back to the question of can you fix them with a serum? And then it's maybe they could be safely reintroduced as a pet.
Yeah.
Could they just look up the Dr. McCoy gave them such and such shot, and then they were fine. So is there a world where they're just happily chilling in people's quarters on Deep Space Nine?
It's dangerous, but yeah, it's possible. It's tricky with something like a serum, so when they have babies, do the babies need the same serum? What happens if the babies don't get the serum? I mean, if they're genetically manipulated, then, presumably then it gets passed on, but it's tricky when you're doing something with a serum. Bashir, I trust though. I mean, he doesn't seem fast and loose. He's the opposite of the Klingons. I'm sure he was very thorough about researching what to do and making sure it didn't have negative ecological impacts. But yeah, I think that something along those lines would work. The Serum one, I would be very nervous about because, like, if they get out and oops, it had babies in the woods and we didn't find them, and then all of a sudden we find 40 million babies in the woods.
So that goes back to the yes, you can give it a serum, but no, it's not the answer to all of your problems.
Exactly. Well said.
Okay. And you've kind of answered the, like, for the purposes of my headcanon, can you make all of the Tribble timelines work together? And the answer is yes, and we can assume that they are happily living with folks because Bashir just took care of it.
Or the Scallop Night.
The Klingons.
Well, the episodes do have a history of ending poorly. Well, and I think too we have this problem. Like, there is another planet somewhere where Tribbles have taken over because in the trouble with Edward, I think when they're debriefing, the captain, they're
say
like,
that.
and then they took over an entire planet.
Yeah.
So if the
so I was wondering about that. How did they get, like, I assume they didn't fall from space. I mean,
the assumption would have to be that the mass increased to the point where they burst from the ship, fell through the atmosphere, survived that, and ended up on the planet.
Well, I think the ship crashed on the planet.
Oh, did the ship crash?
I think the ship was crashing in that last shot.
I thought wasn't it already starting to crack while it was still
Yeah,
in space?
it was, and I think it was going down.
Okay.
I don't think we saw it past then.
And somehow, like, it crashed in such a way that it didn't, like, just engulf them all in flames and have this fiery death of Tribbles.
Seen Starfleet vessels crash and still have a saucer section left over. So
fair point. We've seen that in multiple series. Fair point.
It all depends on whether or not the Tribbles got the shields up before.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. If they did, what was it called? The barrel roll.
Yeah. Well, in theory, with those particular Tribbles reproducing that quickly, only one has to survive to then take over the entire.
That's true.
planet.
That's true. Given they're born pregnant.
So now we have this whole other headcanon plot where those Tribbles survived. Worf says that the Klingons went and they killed all of the Tribbles on the Tribble homeworld, but there's this second world that also has had Tribbles on it.
Yeah.
What has happened with that planet? Or do you just like orbit around it and it's just like a giant
solid Tribble?
It's just all
I mean, at some point they're going to run out of. Well, again, it's the conservation of mass thing. At some point they're going to run out of mass or food or something like that. I guess there would be an ecological disaster, and we see this with some species. Like, imagine locusts that couldn't travel, right? They'd eat up this forest, and then it's like, well, it sucks now. We have a lot of locusts, and there ain't no food. So you'd have this, population expansion, then population crash. Presumably something like that. Sadly, I'm sorry, God, what happened for the Tribble?
Well, and then it comes down to, like, if genetic manipulation aside, if one would assume that there is some sort of evolution, would Tribbles on that planet have time, because they produce so quickly, to evolve to the point where they reproduce?
Natural selection is powerful. So it's quite possible it may happen if there's a crash like that. If you imagine there's variation among the Tribbles, where some of them, let's say the brown ones, they need lots of food and they reproduce really fast. And you have these polka dot ones, and let's say they reproduce much more slowly and need a lot less food. The brown ones are going to die off really fast. And then at that point, maybe like the wheat or whatever, or quinto triticale, I think as they call it in TAS, as opposed to quadro triticale in the other one. But maybe like hexotriticale will start growing back, and then the white ones will then start eating off that because these guys have already died off. So yeah, I mean, natural selection will do that, and natural selection can act really, really, really fast. I mean, we see lots and lots of examples that we know of. So often it's due to predators, but it could certainly be due to food availability and just basically these guys being knocked out because their demands were too high. They needed too much food. Okay,
so we have a question here about the locusts. And I kind of wondered about the Tribbles, and then I was like, is that too morbid? But we're going there now. With the locusts, and it would follow then the Tribbles start eating each other.
No, it still calls. I mean, everything I said still applies. It'll still be a population crash if they're eating each other, because everyone that eats one, that's -1. The Tribbles. So actually, this is a question. I mean, I don't know. Where is its mouth? I mean, it obviously has a mouth, or it has some sort of way of getting quadro or quinto triticale inside. But I mean, would it have to go like hair by hair? I mean, it's gonna be a very slow death.
Do they have to? If they don't have a mouth, like, would they have osmosis? Like, absorb food.
I mean, they might have something more like a fly's proboscis. Like, might have just this little thing that just sucks up a tiny little thing. I could imagine something like that. Because I mean, again, if they're only eating grain, they don't have teeth. I guess that would be the problem again with them eating each other too. If they don't have teeth, like, what would you do? I mean,
you'd have to evolve a larger proboscis, and in the time you've done that, you've probably
that wouldn't happen. Yeah, mostly because you can't evolve something. Basically, it's not like you can't evolve something just out of nowhere, right? There has to be like something that's kind of close to it. So unless there's some Tribble that happened to have teeth and a mouth, which there probably wasn't to start with. I mean, you can imagine a slow developing Tribble, sure, but like a Tribble that happens to have a mouth with teeth, that's a pretty extreme thing.
The brain, does it need to masticate that a little bit more before it can digest it?
Not necessarily. I mean, it may have something like a gizzard inside, like birds have. So it may have something inside that grinds up the grain after it's already in. But the tricky thing is, again, with birds, like you can have your little seed or whatever that you're eating. But like if you have this, it's like, okay, how do you get this inside this? Like, it's not really clear what happens there.
So the locusts might eat each other, but the Tribble can't.
Yeah, I mean, locusts do have, they have actual mouths, of course, so they actually can like chew into each other and things like that. But not so clear. I mean, it's possible. Again, we haven't seen their undersides so much, or at least not that we know of. Maybe like if you part the hair, there are these like vicious teeth. That would be horrifying.
There is an element of Tribbles that we haven't touched on that I'm really excited to get into, and that is Klingons and Tribbles. And while there's also some Klingon genealogy that I'm really excited to talk about,
sure.
The question related to Klingons and Tribbles is this idea that Tribbles hate them, and the Klingons aren't like, oh, those are Tribbles. Like, they immediately hate each other.
Yeah.
But there also doesn't seem to be any kind of understanding that they've seen each other before.
Nope.
Is there a precedent in nature
Sure.
for one species meeting another and just reacting?
Immediately having a strong reaction. Absolutely, yeah. It's weird, actually. There's a lot of cases of that. So it's common. I mean, at least I've seen papers on it, mostly in the context of mating behavior, that sometimes like a species will see a species never seen before, but it's like crazy attracted to it. Which doesn't make any sense because A, it's another species, so you probably can't make like fertile offspring from it, so it's probably not good. But what's happened is in some way, like they have, it's kind of like what we'll sometimes call like a super stimulus that, like, for whatever reason, like let's say Tribbles are attracted to or are repelled by a particular smell or a particular color or something like that, and then along comes the Klingon. It's not like it was trying to do it because of the Klingon. It just happens to have that color or that scent or something like that. And Tribbles like, and it's just, again, with a lot of animals like this, it's stimulus response. It's kind of like a computer program. It's not thinking, oh, that is a Klingon, it's going to hurt me, I'm going to fight. It's just like that, that nerve fired. And when that nerve fires, I scream. and then I think in terms of the Klingons, I think it's less that they hate the Tribbles as much as they hate the fact that Tribbles scream when they're around them. I think if the Tribbles were silent, they'd be kind of neutral on them, like, whatever, get out of my way.
Well, so like, is there a possibility then that it was just the one Tribble that responded, or that only some Tribbles have that reaction?
Absolutely. There's often variation in terms of preferences or in terms of response to particular stimuli. Absolutely, could be that. So
this entire Klingon Tribble war could just be based on one grumpy Tribble.
Well, probably not one grumpy Tribble, because remember, they got beamed onto the ship at the end of Tribble. Right. So I'm guessing if just one was screaming, they would have killed that one and they would have just ignored the rest of them. I'm guessing that it's at least fairly common among Tribbles. Now, one thing we don't know is how are all these Tribbles related? Right? Because we're assuming that, like, I'm saying this in the context of like, oh, there's so many Tribbles, but they all came with Cyrano Jones. I'm assuming Cyrano Jones didn't have like this Santa Claus sack that he was walking around with. He instead just had it like in his pockets. Maybe all the Tribbles he has are really closely related and genetically very similar, but on the home world, maybe they're quite different. So maybe in that sense, it could be actually a flawed war.
Well, and if McCoy talks about them as maybe like colony kind of things, like, is there a possibility? We don't know how they communicate with each other, right? Like, is there a hive mind thing, or are they trilling like, hey, these Klingons, they suck, so scream at them, and that's what got all of them yelling? Yeah, like, it's also possible that, like, if one yells that others yell. I mean, that's, this in something else with alarm calls, that it's not like every one of them has to see the bad thing, but like one makes the alarm call and others immediately start screaming too, because there's an advantage to that, right? That, if there isn't, the eagle is coming to attack the rodents or whatever, then it's good if everybody's screaming so we can get out of here as opposed to just the one.
create this pandemonium.
This is hilarious. Now I'm picturing the Tribbles wigging out in a field of lilacs, and everyone being like, "There's no Klingons here." In the Deep Space Nine episode, they accuse Worf of smelling like lilacs. So if the Tribbles are responding to the scent of lilacs, then
it's possible.
out in a field of lilacs.
It would beg the question of why Tribbles evolved that response to lilac scent, but oh no.
I get the feeling like there's a whole bunch of Tribble history that we don't have.
Maybe lilacs have like Tribble lice on them. So imagine like lice on this. Woo!
I mean, could it be a poisonous thing? Like it's deadly?
Yeah, or it's just some sort of bloodsucker. It doesn't have to be poisonous, but yeah, there's all sorts of things. Yeah, but Tribbles with lice, that'd be ooh. That would be a mess.
The response between the Tribbles and the Klingons doesn't necessarily have to indicate that there's some like historical meeting that happened between the two. Because I also am kind of fascinated by like what would that event have to have been that would put it into Tribbles, whether they have DNA or not, to respond that way.
No, I'm assuming it was due to something completely unrelated and just coincidental the Klingons, especially those Klingons, because that was TOS Klingons, which basically looked like humans.
Well, so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
A whole other can of worms. I think various Star Treks have kind of offered some different explanations.
Yep.
I'm not going to lead you anywhere.
It's good to do it today. Today's Mary Chico's birthday too. So
yeah.
So my question is, tell me what you think of how Klingons work in terms.
So that's a great question. It's interesting. I feel like there's been so much anger about this in the Star Trek community, but I mean, look at how much variation there is among humans on Earth. I don't feel like Klingons are. I mean, they're a little bit more. I mean, well, especially the human looking versus the non-human. Like if you take out the TOS Klingons, so let's exclude them for a minute. I don't feel like among the remaining Klingons they're that. I mean, yeah, they're different, but are they dramatically more different than the variation we see among humans on Earth? Maybe, but not noticeably so. So I feel like people have over pushed that. And I noticed that in terms of, this is slight tangent, in Star Trek Picard, I noticed they retconned the Romulans in terms of the foreheads by saying, "Oh, he's a northerner," right? And it's like that. There's no reason that couldn't be true for like all the species we see. Maybe like Andorians in this part of the planet versus that part of the planet look a little different. Klingons in this part of the planet versus that part of the planet. And heck, I mean, we know of Klingons on Kronos, but maybe there's Klingons that have been on other worlds for like a long time, right? And maybe they, over that time, they've changed their appearance, over a couple of, thousands of years. I don't know that that's not true. But the human-looking ones, that's a little bit more problem because those really are fundamentally pretty different. But they had in Enterprise, they had the augment virus and stuff like that was supposed to explain that away. So.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, there was a panel for Star Trek Online earlier today, and Dr. Erin McDonald was talking about which things she sees as a scientist that drive her absolutely crazy, and which things she's willing to just kind of let go of. So I guess following on that, were Klingons something that bothered you?
Not in the least. Not in the least. As an evolutionary biologist, I study variation within species all the time. So for me, it's like, whatever, yeah, okay. I mean, it'd be different if like one came out and looked like a squid or something like that. I'd be like, what the heck? I mean, like, I will say one that did bother me that's not the Klingon thing is the Zindi. That one from Enterprise. That was because they were saying that these are all 99.5% the same at the DNA level. And one, it looks like a whale. One looks like an insect. And one was like, okay. What is this? This is like way out there. And supposedly they're kind of one species, but kind of not. Like, oh, okay, I don't know what's happening there.
That's when you're like, make me a consultant.
Yeah, right. The Klingons, though, there's some variation there, but it's fine.
So this is kind of going back to the talk about Tribbles a little bit. This is a response to how they talk to each other, and this is one person asking. So maybe Tribbles have a hive mind?
Maybe. I'm not sure exactly what that would mean in this context. So in the sense, are they sharing? I mean, when we think of hive mind, like in the context of the Borg, they're actually like directly communicating. I'm not sure what she means by that specifically, but maybe in some way they're communicating and somehow reiterating each other's signals. In that sense, sure. I mean, it's quite possible.
Or would that be something? I mean, I think, and again, I'm not the science person here in the slightest, but like I think I've heard discussion of like one generation passing on learned knowledge to the next generation. So if tribbles are replicating so quickly, would it be something where a tribble could meet a Klingon, go, oh, this is bad, and then pretty soon down the line, all of its descendants hate Klingons?
So the tricky thing about that is that one of two things has to happen for that to be true. Either there's actual like teaching in some way, or like some sort of something along those lines, or there's a genetic change. So the teaching thing, I mean, it doesn't seem like tribbles have any sort of parental behavior. It seems like they just kind of, offspring's gone, I'm moving on. It doesn't seem like they're doing anything beyond that. Genetic change,
that information be traveled through genes like that.
Yeah, so this is tricky because then the genes have to change in response to what they're seeing in the environment. And there are examples of that, and it's often referred to as transgenerational epigenetic effects. And so what happens there is like the DNA itself doesn't change, but like basically kind of the way it's packaged and little molecules are added to it. That can do that sort of thing, but that's not, at least for, us, again, maybe it's completely different for tribbles. For us, that's not so common. Like, it seems like although that happens, that's kind of on the fringe. Like it's mostly everything is just the way it is. It's not like your DNA changes based on what you've experienced almost at all, with the exception of this slight bit of marks on your DNA. And even those marks tend to go away after a couple of generations. They're not like stable forever on kind of thing. But again, alien species. The doors are open to do anything. Sure, maybe it does. Maybe the DNA is directly altered in response to something that it experienced in the environment.
Well, I think the other question that I have, again, going back to genetic modification and like how many versions of tribbles or subspecies now are, like how many of them do we have to think are out there, is if Edward manipulated tribbles by adding his DNA to tribbles and it's human DNA, and at the time humans and Klingons were not friends, is it possible that it's the human in the tribble that doesn't like the Klingon?
So the assumption for that, I mean, I like the hypothesis. The assumption for that would be that basically it's genetic that we don't like Klingons, which I don't think that's true.
Oh, that's fair. All right.
Yeah. If that were true, though, but it's possible. So I mean, but let me retcon it a little bit for you, though. I mean, they say Vulcans perceive humans as smelling bad. Maybe humans perceive Klingons as smelling bad. Maybe that's part of why they haven't gotten along. I mean, maybe they've not commented on it because they're all being very polite.
Edward maybe doesn't like lilac.
Yeah, no, exactly. Maybe Edward doesn't like lilac. So in that sense, maybe in some way that then had some impact on some, olfactory receptor in the tribbles from there on out. So that's a slight retcon towards what you're talking about.
So I guess I'm curious, if you're talking about manipulating DNA by splicing a bit of one species into another, how much can you potentially pass on? We're talking about passing on very specific.
Yeah, no, so I was assuming things are very precisely engineered. It's not just like a random segment of human got introduced to a drill, because that would almost for sure not be good. Almost for sure would just do something bizarre. But I'm assuming that, at this point in time in the future, they have a pretty good idea of what every human gene does and how it interacts and things like that. And they know that with these tribbles that presumably Edward spent some time studying, it's like, okay, I'm going to use this and this will alter its olfactory receptors. And assuming they have olfactory receptors. It's true, we don't know how they smell, but or if they do smell. But again, I'm just making up and saying they do. Again, with sort of precision genetic manipulation, it's pretty feasible. If it's just random, like let's say that you just insert some human DNA in there, that makes it a little bit more like Jurassic Park. It's like, yeah, no, that doesn't work.
Well, then I guess there's a lot of question involved in terms of how competent Edward's genetic manipulation really would have been, or how good it would have been.
True.
Is he one of those people that does? There isn't a lot of respect for Edward in that episode.
There's really not.
Is he one of those quiet evil geniuses that is actually very capable of? And then in that case, do we have to assume that Edward planned what happened?
That's a good question. I mean, it's tricky. I bet. I mean, that far in the future, I bet genetic manipulations are. I mean, right now, genetic manipulations are. They're not easy, but they're not. I mean, you could teach an undergrad to do it in a couple weeks, kind of thing, right? So it's not like it's not like somebody takes like years of training to do. Like, yeah, you could learn. I wouldn't be surprised if that far in the future there's like machines and devices and stuff like that, especially when you're working with something this size. I wouldn't be surprised if there's machines and devices that actually could just do it fairly straightforward. Now, one tricky thing with any sort of genetic manipulation for something that is already like this size and not a single cell is how, like, let's say, for example, I did some genetic manipulation. Let's say I inserted some of my DNA into this thing. It's not like it's going to suddenly be in every cell of this. It's just going to be in like one cell of this. So genetic manipulations work best if you're working with, like, say, like a first cell embryo or like or a gamete even. That's where it would actually work. Now, maybe Edward did that. I mean, I guess with Tribbles, since they reproduce so fast, it actually wouldn't be that hard. Then maybe he actually did something with like a Tribble egg, like actual egg cell. And that's what then would work. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's much easier than we're thinking, at least at that point in time in the future.
Which is interesting, though, because they talk about how genetic manipulation for humans is so banned, and all of the other ethics of Star Trek point to all life being respected equally.
Yeah, well, sentient.
Right, all sentient life. So then how do we, and that's one of the questions that comes up in the Trouble with Edward, like, is it sentient? And he's like, well, I can make it stupid, which is not what we're looking for.
That was the best response. Like, are you serious?
But then, like, do we really think that they would have developed all of this technology? I guess they do a lot of genetic modification stuff. Anyway, so this is getting into ethics, but like, how does that work? Where like this genetic manipulation is okay, but that genetic manipulation is
well.
not.
So the question in terms of protocol is almost sidesteps that, because I mean, basically, you would have learned to do it because you're working with like wheat or whatever, in the meantime. So you would have learned the procedure for doing it with that, or maybe if they're allowing it to happen with chickens. I don't know if they're allowing it to happen with chickens at that point in the future. The protocol wouldn't be any different than for say a Tribble than for like a chicken. So in that sense, they could have learned to do it, and then. Again, as you said, he kind of went rogue. So I think you're right. I think they probably would not have let him do any of these things. Well, I think that's even pretty explicit in the episode. They wouldn't have let him do that. But the know-how for doing it was very readily there. And honestly, like, we could almost, I mean, not quite, we could almost do that now. So you're going that far in the future. Sure.
So I think the takeaway from all of this is that all of the craziness surrounding Tribbles is way more plausible than I would ever have imagined.
I'm taking advantage of a lot of uncertainty, though. Like, in the sense, I'm assuming that, like, again, that they have DNA. I'm assuming that the technologies that they're using elsewhere work for these. A lot of assumptions there, but it at least doesn't seem crazy. Maybe that's a better way of saying it.
So you're being very generous and trying to kind of soothe those of us who need some help piecing all of this.
Well, you get a paycheck from Star Trek, so.
That's fair. But I think that this has just been delightful, just trying to wrap our heads around all of the different times and places that Tribbles have appeared. And I think one at this point now has to imagine that there are multiple species or subspecies of Tribbles, and each of them is
really some sort of variation,
is doing something different, so that you could potentially have a Tribble that stays in your quarters and is fairly safe, but it could also be a lot of trouble if it's one of those that hasn't been.
Yep.
And I guess what we will never know is, does the original Tribble produce quickly, and we've been interacting only with modified Tribbles? Or have they always produced quickly, and the only safe Tribbles have been modified? And I guess that's what we can't untangle, right?
Or maybe there was just always variation. Maybe there was always some fast and some slow.
maybe Cyrano Jones thought he had the ones that didn't.
Got the outfit for Cyrano Jones.
Maybe the root of the trouble here is just that he went to get Tribbles and grabbed the wrong variation.
That could be. Or, but to some extent, if with Cyrano Jones, he probably, if you imagine somebody sold it to him, of course he'd sell the fast reproducing one, because that's the one you could make a lot of really quickly and easily. So of course he'd sell that one. I mean, that one, because you could just make more very quickly. Whereas if there's a slow one, you're like, no, I'm going to hide that thing.
So the new takeaway is that despite the number of times Tribbles have already appeared, there is still so much territory to be mined, and so we should just keep giving us more Tribbles.
Definitely, we want to see Tribbles. We'll see what I want to know what Tribbles are doing in the 32nd century and Discovery. there's all sorts of new varieties at that point.
That would be awesome. Well, we have
Maybe they
already.
have antennae.
Maybe they're grudgeful.
Oh, maybe that is what grudge is.
Well, now we're gonna get. You probably know things that you can't tell us, so we're gonna have to just. Yeah. But we have already been talking about this for almost an hour, and we have a whole bunch of other amazing panels coming up. But I'm really disappointed to have to end this conversation because I'm having a lot of fun.
We only got through like half of our questions. We'll have to part 2 at some point.
Well, I enjoyed it thoroughly, but everybody should totally tune in for the Sci-Fi Sisters. 2 thumbs up for them.
Amazing.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
2 thumbs up for them.
Absolutely. So everyone be sure to check that out. And then also make sure you head over to Vendors Hall, HAUL.com, and check out the vendor pages because there are some really incredible deals going on there that are so good right now. So in between the panels, of course, but make sure you head over there once things wrap up tonight and get all your sci-fi shopping out of the way because there's some really fantastic stuff. So thank you again, Dr. Noor, for joining.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for my Tribble too.
You're so welcome. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Totally.
Goodbye.